Everybody knows one guy who thinks the refs are out to get his team, who hate his team, maybe even paid under the table to make bad calls against his team, and we just roll our eyes. But then there's that one game that makes us think maybe he's not so crazy.
But hold on, Oklahoma's got the football, and they're saying, wait a minute, the pileups over there, we've got the ball over here. It's actually hit before 10 yards, and it's hit by an Oregon player. That's illegal.
After review, there's conclusive video evidence that the ball was touched by a receiving team player, which makes the ball live.
This did not happen.
Oregon ball. That's a bad call. That's a bad call.
What's going on, everybody? CollegeFootballNerds.com coming at you with something interesting, getting a little bit outside of our comfort zone on this one. It's the top 5 worst refereeing calls that had some sort of postseason significance or impact, maybe even national championship significance or impact. 2 rules on this. One, if you like what we're doing, please give us a subscribe, especially since we have some new faces, I'm sure, or will have, since this content's a little different from what we normally do. And number 2, let us know in the comments what you think was an egregious or the most egregious call that the refs missed that had some sort of significance besides just giving you a sad face because your team lost on a bad call. All right. One other thing of note, 2003 Ohio State Miami is off the table. We're going to dedicate an entire video to that game. And we don't think it's in the top 5 because we think they got the call right. All right. So we put this out there on the Twitter sphere and we said, Twitter, help us out. Give us some recommendations on which games or which calls should be included in our list of grievances. Festivus for the rest of us. That's a Seinfeld joke for you young folks. And this happened. And then we were thinking about it. It was probably because we got a Twitter shout out retweet from this guy.
Again, folks, it's RJ Young.
And it makes sense. A lot of you Oklahoma fans following us on Twitter, a lot of us on YouTube, but this also was a really bad call. I've got my co-host here, Josh. We're going to talk about how bad it was. Josh, I'm going to set this up with a pretty heavy question, and that question I'm putting to you is, were the Pac-10 officials outright just straight up cheating? And I don't like to accuse anyone of cheating. I'm almost always in the pocket of the refs, supporting them because they have a really hard job, and most of these calls are subjective. This one was not. So before you answer that question, let me set it up for you and tell you why it looked like cheating and let you go from there. All right. First things first, the ball's got to go 10 yards on an onside kick. We all know that. Oregon touches the ball at the 8 or 9 yard mark. Not Oklahoma, which means it should have died right there. Second, Oklahoma recovered the ball, and it didn't even look like, if you look at the picture we're going to show, didn't even look like the Oklahoma fan had the attention of the refs, even though it was holding the ball. Almost like they were faking, looking for who had the ball in there so they could, have something to cover up later. I don't know. And then they said after the review, by the way, this is the first year of instant replay, the review was conclusive that Oklahoma touched the ball, which they did not. And another weird thing is Pac-10 at the time, I don't know if they still did this. Somebody help me out in the comments. When they had a home and home and the team played in the Pac-10 stadium, they also supplied Pac-10 refs and Pac-10 replay booth people. Now, other conferences do it different. They're like, okay, if you're going to come and play in our house, we don't want it to be looked at as ultimate favoritism, so we're going to let you bring your refs from your conference on the field, and maybe we'll have our refs up in the booth, maybe not. So all of these things are kind of stacking up. And just finally, it wasn't a subjective call, Josh. This was clear as day in the instant replay. Yes, there was a pass interference play later that I can give them a little leeway on. Oklahoma fans right now are saying, no way, ball was tipped. We'll talk about it later. But in my mind, Josh, what they were saying, yeah, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to rebut this. They were saying, here's an opportunity for us to steal a high-profile win, and all we have to do in exchange for it is suspend our reffing crew, for one game. Totally fair trade. We'll oops, I'm sorry afterwards, but totally worth it. So, Josh, were they outright cheating? And if not, you got to give me something that would supply some benefit of the doubt. Let's go with it.
So it's not really my view that the referees were cheating. When you look at what happens in college football, everything's a little bit subjective. Everything has to do with the eye test. And you got to remember, this was the first year of instant replay. There's a lot of stuff going on. This is occurring at Oregon. Oregon Stadium was built to be loud. It's a built-for-purpose acoustic stadium where sound reverberates. This was kind of getting into the time when Oregon was at its height. It was an incredibly loud atmosphere. It's loud for the referees, just like it is the players. They get discombobulated. What ends up happening? Well, they get tunnel vision. They're focusing on whether or not the ball goes 10 yards. Now, I don't think the ball goes 10 yards. I think it's pretty clear the ball doesn't go 10 yards. But I don't think they're cheating in finding that it didn't. And one of the more difficult things I will say in college football compared to something like college basketball, which, quite frankly, has had some instances where they're cheating, it's hard for an entire group of refs to cheat together. And yeah, they may be in the Pac-12, but you still are relying on an entire group of people to all choose to, cheat as a collective rather than having one person that can make an individual call, one person that can blow the whistle. And then there's the second aspect. This is the first year that instant replay is in place. This is the first year that the guys in the booth are having to work with it. These officials are not necessarily the most technologically savvy guys in the world, more than likely. Moreover, they're not operating in an HD environment like we have now. They don't have advanced systems where they can go frame by frame, more than likely. They're probably working with a fairly simple system. They may even be tied to ESPN's broadcast. I'm not 100% sure how that worked at the time. But at the very least, I know they don't have the advanced systems they have today. Now they can take a 4K camera that's actually filming the games. And even though we may not get a 4K broadcast, they can digitally zoom in on a particular frame to try to figure out what's going on. ESPN, you can see in their shot, kept cutting away before they ever saw the ball get picked up. There's one small frame where you can see the ball between an Oklahoma player's legs. It's never in the possession of the Oregon player. Afterwards, an Oklahoma player picks up the ball from behind the other Oklahoma player and runs away with it. It's quite possible the replay officials either, one, made the same mistake ESPN did and didn't cut to it, or two, they maybe were even just relying on the ESPN broadcast and looking at the broadcast in the booth, and they screwed it up on that end. Now, they're not going to be able to hear the audio, let's be clear, and it's pretty clear the commentators know what's going on and what went wrong, but it's a good chance the referees didn't. So my view is this incompetent? Oh, heck yes. But was it cheating? That I kind of doubt.
All right, Oklahoma fans, I brought him on. I thought we'd get some support. We got none. What we got is Grim Reaper Josh kind of peeing in everybody's Cheerios. I wanted some juicy, meaty refs were cheating commentary, didn't get it. So, Josh, I'm going to give you another chance, or maybe give you a little rebuttal to your point to keep us maybe in the cheating zone, and I probably agree with you. But two things. One, let's take the 10 yards off the table for a minute. When there's an onside kick, you probably need to see who actually recovered. And clearly from the video we've got, from the pictures we've got, from the fact that there's an Oklahoma guy standing with the ball while the refs are looking in the pile, to me that says that Oregon didn't recover. Secondly, going back to the 10 yards thing, they said in their explanation to the audience that an Oklahoma player conclusively, based on video evidence, touched the ball before 10 yards. Therefore, it was a live ball and Oregon recovered. None of that happened. So is it a situation where back in 2006, they didn't have the ruling on the field is confirmed sort of situation, and so they had to sort of make something up that fit the call, sort of like, let's have the instant replay excuse fit the original call instead of having the original call held up by the instant replay, or something else happened? Does that give you a little bit of a doubt since they said conclusively something happened that clearly did not?
Well, at the time they did have the rule that they were supposed to rule on the field and then determine whether or not that rule stood or whether it was confirmed. Now, the screw up here, I think, is, one, I don't think the officials really ever made a true call on the field. And it's hard to tell in the broadcast because they're going back and doing replays, but it's never really clear that the officials made a true ruling. And I don't think the officials ever really had a firm idea of what the ruling was, and I don't think they ever had a real powwow and said, this is the official ruling on the field, now let's go to instant replay. I think they turned to instant replay to make the call for them. And to a certain degree, this sort of exemplifies why that's the wrong approach. Because when they did that, they gave all power to that one guy sitting in the booth looking at a video screen on an old school 480p, 480i actually, monitor, and he screwed up. Now, whether that guy screwed up inadvertently or not is a different question. I brought up the fact that college basketball is a little different because one guy can blow the whistle, call a technical, and he can blow an entire game. And there have been some serious betting controversies that have occurred with officials because of that. But if you want to talk about a way where somebody could swing a game, it's got a situation like this where you've got one guy in the replay booth that has all the power. He makes a determination of what's going on. And the guys on the field, when they say it was conclusive, I mean, they're not watching the replay. So they're just assuming he's right.
One thing I will say that's in your favor here is if the refs were cheating, you would probably also see a wide gap in actual penalties on the field. 8 penalties for 69 yards for Oklahoma, 6 penalties for 49 yards for Oregon. So there's nothing huge there. Oklahoma fans are going to point to later in that drive, the pass interference call. And I think it was tough. The ball was tipped, and they did say that it wasn't conclusive. It was conclusively tipped. The problem I had with that pass interference call is it looks like he's jamming. If I remember correctly, it was either a safety or like a slot corner that was giving space on the slot receiver. So when he pressed him, he didn't press him at the line. He pressed him like 7-8 yards downfield, like as he started into his break. And I think he made contact before the ball was tipped, which would have at worst been defensive holding. So does that kind of support it? If there's not a huge disparity between penalty yards, if they came into this saying, okay, we're going to cheat and win one for the Pac-10, they probably would have been doing things throughout the game and not just there at the end, because that was really luck they even had that opportunity.
I think the last thing you said is probably where I would come from with this. Oklahoma had to put themselves in a position where they were able to lose the game, where an onside kick mattered for this to happen. And, the officials, you can say they blew the game, and they did, and this has always been true in the sport of college football, and that's kind of why we're interested to do these videos. If you're in the position where you can lose a game at the last second, then it's going to be kind of, to a certain degree, your fault when you do. And Oklahoma put themselves in a position where they had to get that onside kick to be able to put the game away. They weren't able to do that. That caused them to be able to lose the game. Now, from the cheating perspective, I think the officials, if they were going to throw that game, they would have had to do it earlier. When you get to that final drive, all Oklahoma has to do is cleanly catch that ball and the game's over, no matter what. The officials wouldn't have had an ability to change that. So I think that kind of cuts against it as well.
All right, so one of the things that we said in the open is that we're not just picking bad calls. There's a lot of bad calls that we can think about throughout college football history. Some would be maybe even more interesting to talk about. Maybe not more interesting than this one, because this one was really bad. But we wanted to talk about games that had potential significance in the postseason impact. I would argue that this one did. 2006, this was Florida, I think Ohio State. This was the year that Ohio State, Michigan played a real tight one, and everybody thought maybe Michigan might get a rematch there. Number 2, Florida's resume was they like Oklahoma also had a double-digit loss in conference. They had a 10-point loss to Auburn, who was a decent, not elite team. They had 5 one-score wins, which I think is important. It's not looked at enough. It should be, especially when some of those one-score wins were against crappy teams. We've harped on that a lot. And they had 3 ranked wins, Arkansas, Tennessee, and LSU. Oklahoma's resume, they had an 18-point loss to Texas. It was just 2 weeks after this debacle. They probably were a little bit downtrodden. I bet it played into it a little bit. They only had 3 one-score wins, blew a lot of other teams out. They had 2 ranked wins, Texas A&M and Nebraska. So Oklahoma's resume, even if you take this loss off the table, Oklahoma's resume probably not as good as Florida's resume, but I think it's safe to say two things. One, if you take this win off the table, Oklahoma is right there in the conversation for playing in the national championship game, even with the loss to Texas. Two, if you take this just will and soul crushing loss off the table, who knows mentally how it would impact Oklahoma throughout the season. A good example of this was last year, the 77-70 whatever game, LSU and Texas A&M. LSU thought they had that game won. It came back later, that freak call where the knee was down, interception got wiped off the board, and that team was defeated after that. Yes, they stayed in it a lot of overtimes, but they were defeated after that. So, do you think us picking this game at number 5, do you think that maybe there is an argument that this call did have potentially significant postseason impact?
I definitely think there's an argument that this call had a major postseason impact. When you look at their schedule that year, they lose to Oregon in week 3. The remainder of the season, they played 4 teams that were ranked at the time of play: Texas, Missouri, Texas A&M, and Nebraska. They lost only to Texas 10-28. It was obviously in the Red River rivalry, a neutral game in the Cotton Bowl. But more importantly, they didn't lose from October 8 to the rest of the season. And as we know many times in college football, if you don't lose for the last, 8 weeks of the regular season, you're probably going to climb back up in the rankings. And the other thing we've talked about quite a lot in regard to a lot of teams, like why Alabama repeated in 2011, why teams end up where they are in the postseason, it really has more to do with who else is out there and what their resumes were. 2006 was the year that Ohio State and Michigan were undefeated until they played each other. And Ohio State beat Michigan. Florida ended up jumping Michigan to take that number 2 slot. Behind them, it wasn't very strong resumes. You had LSU, who was 10-2. Louisville was 11-1. Wisconsin was 11-1. And Oklahoma ended up being 7th going into the bowl season at 11-2. So, assuming they would have jumped 10-2 LSU, which I think is fair, and they would have jumped Louisville and Wisconsin due to the strength of schedule, that puts them no worse than 4th. And now the question is, how would they fare against a 1-loss Florida and a 1-loss Michigan? Well, Michigan was a rematch, so people didn't want that anyway. And as you've already talked about, Florida, a lot of people thought they didn't need to be in the game because they'd had so many one-score wins themselves. I think Oklahoma would have had a really darn good chance of getting that slot that Florida ended up taking. And so, it's hard to say exactly how it pans out. I mean, we can talk about how it changes Oklahoma's season, but just that one loss in and of itself has a pretty good shot of putting Oklahoma in the national title.
All right, so let's wrap this up. We're trying to keep these short, which y'all know was really rare for us. But we're trying something different. Again, we're going to do 5 of these and a bonus one that's just going to discuss Ohio State and Miami. Everybody wants us to talk about that one. I don't think it's going to be in these 5 because, like I said in the open, I think they got the call right. But Josh, this is probably the one that we're going to discuss that had the least impact on the postseason national championship and significance, though it still does. Is there one that you could think of that maybe would have been a 5B or an alternate that we should have discussed that maybe we'll discuss in a future series?
It's definitely the Central Michigan versus Oklahoma State game.
Okay.
And we had this discussion, so I know this isn't surprising you, where I begged you to be able to include it, but it didn't really meet our criteria. So obviously in that game, if you haven't seen it, you're in a situation where Oklahoma State has the ball last. The guy throws the ball out of bounds on 4th down. It's an intentional grounding call, and the clock runs out. Now, an intentional grounding call is a loss of down. That is not supposed to let you run another play just for the sake of penalty. So if the clock runs out on a loss of down play, like intentional grounding, that game can actually end on that penalty. Normally, if there's a holding call or whatnot, you get a free play. It doesn't on an intentional grounding. So what is unique about Central Michigan versus Oklahoma State, it not only was a completely wrong call, but it was a procedurally wrong call, meaning there's no subjectivity to it whatsoever. There was a way the call was supposed to be made. Everybody agreed the situation on the field, and it was called wrong. Central Michigan gets an extra play. They score on the extra play that shouldn't have happened, and win the game. So if it was called correctly, the game is flat over. And there's no question that the game should have ended with Oklahoma State winning. There's no argument to the contrary. It's probably unique in of the fact that I actually think that win should have been taken from Central Michigan. Because you could definitively say this game ended a play earlier. The referee screwed up and let a play go where the clock was already expired. There was no question of what should have happened in that. There was no question of the fact that nothing weird could have happened. The game was over. So I think that one is probably unique in college football history in that was a play that you can completely argue the win should have been taken away from the team that won the game because the play should have never happened. The game was literally over, and they ran a play after the game ended to be able to win.
All right, y'all. That's it. We promised a short one. You got a pretty short one for our standards. Remember the 2 rules. If you like what we're doing, give us a subscribe. I have to slow that down because I have a hard time saying that word for some reason. Second, in the comments, let us know which games we should talk about 1 through 4 or 4 through 1 because we're going to count down on these and make your case as to why not only the call was bad from the refereeing standpoint, but also how it had postseason significance. So just don't just pick one because you're frustrated because it was your team and it was a bad call. Every fan has those. We want postseason significance bad calls, even calls that were in the postseason. There's going to be some that make this series. So make your case. Thanks a lot for sticking with us this long. Y'all have a great week and God bless.